Buying a home and having your own space is considered a major life goal for many people. A property that belongs to you, where you are safe, where you have full control. But in this episode of On the Green Fence, we're going to look at what happens when people turn their backs on this traditional idea of housing and instead decide to share their home with strangers.
I do see the future as being far more about infrastructures of sharing, not private ownership. And that, of course, addresses affordability as well as ecological sustainability and conviviality.
It's nearly difficult to now think about living alone because I would never move back again into an own flat. I think my life has become so much more rich and healthy in that respect because I meet people that are so different from me every day, and to have this feeling of being part of a community.
If you're an introvert, it becomes a pain altogether, a bigger trouble for you that you've got to now face another 40 set of people every day when you're back from work.
All sorts of negative consequences arise when you can't, at least from time to time, as you feel you need it, go into a space. It's your territory that you control.
I'm Neil King, and welcome to On the Green Fence. I don't know about you, but I must admit that pretty much from day one, when I started earning my own money, it was my goal in life to start a family and get my own house. It was something I never really questioned, especially not environmentally. The only question for me was, what kind of house can I afford and where? And it was a thought pattern that I just assumed was normal among Germans because pretty much all my peers at the time, they were thinking along the same lines. But interestingly enough, I'm in fact in the minority here because Germany is a country of renters. Less than half of the population owns a home. It has the lowest home ownership rate in the EU. But even here, surveys show that around 58% of people agree with the statement, everyone would buy a property if they could afford to. In Europe as a whole, more than 2/3 of young people see buying a home as a symbol of success. That's a very strong idea in many other parts of the world too, as my Indian colleague Ashutosh Pandey will explain a bit later in this episode. But first, let's just get to the core of this. Why is it that we need a home? What's driving us on a psychological level? And to find out more about that, I got in touch with Dr. Sally Augustin. She's an environmental psychologist who looks at how experiences in the physical world influence what goes on in our heads.
It's true of all humans. It's sort of inbred in us, if you will. You know, it's left over from our really early days as a species when we could only truly relax and decompress when we were in a space where we knew it was really, really, really unlikely that something negative would happen, like a bear or a tiger would eat us, you know.
Now, of course, I mean, today, in most places, it's very unlikely that we're going to be attacked by bears or tigers.
That's right. Unlikely. But our brains are set up in a way that we're still attuned to, potential threats and can only really, really relax when we're sure that they're not likely to influence us.
Mm-hmm. So there is that security element there, right? So that we feel safe.
Right. But there's other things about your home that are important too. Your home and what you do in it, to it, are important because they send signals to you and to any people that might visit your home.
Mm-hmm.
And the sort of signals they send are about, what you value about yourself as a person.
I mean, if we're kind of like a territorial, species, something that, it is important to us to have our own space.
Right.
What about ownership? Is it really important, that we also own this space? Are we programmed also to acquire our own home?
You need to have control of the space over time, or we might say you might need control of the space repeatedly in order to get these benefits, but you don't need to technically own it. The space doesn't need to be large. It can be a closet, literally, that's big enough for a chair. That could be your territory, as long as there's air holes punched in the door or whatever. So, you don't get asphyxiated in there. You can establish a territory in a space that's actually quite quite small, and also a space that you don't technically own, as long as you have some control over it.
And what happens if we don't have that space? If we don't have control over, our little space where we can retreat to?
Well, when you don't have control, your brain doesn't really have a chance to decompress. And people who remember records and record players are familiar with like a skipping record. That's the kind of thing that your brain starts to do when it doesn't ever get a chance to go into a space that's owned, that's a territory. Your cognitive performance declines, you get grumpy, so you're not good company. All sorts of negative consequences arise when you can't, at least from time to time, as you feel you need it, go into a space. It's your territory that you control.
Okay, so the most important thing, psychologically speaking, according to Sally, is to have a private space, a safe territory, even if it's tiny and even if we don't own it. But alternative home ownership models are emerging, or re-emerging in some cases, in response to what's happening in the world today. And what is happening? Affordable housing and space, they're in short supply in many cities. At the same time, in Western countries, populations are aging, and more people are finding themselves living alone in big homes, way too big for them. And then there's the growing awareness about the impact of our lifestyles on the planet and the need to minimise our carbon footprint. Buildings and the construction sector are responsible for nearly 40% of greenhouse gas emissions.
Can you hear me?
I can. Excellent.
Yeah, I'm not used to
Helen
wearing
Jarvis is a
headphones,
professor
so
of social geography engagement at the University of Newcastle in the UK, and she's been researching co-housing in different countries. Now, what is co-housing? Well, broadly, it's a community made up of multiple families or residents who share ownership and make decisions about managing the property together. They'd typically have their own fully equipped private spaces with bedroom, kitchen, etc., and then have access to large common areas with shared facilities like a laundry room, tool, workshop, library, guest dining room, etc. Now, the idea is, of course, to be or living in a more communal way while cutting down on the space and the carbon footprint. So this kind of setup, it's not essentially anything new. There have been many different examples of collective living throughout history. Co-housing itself dates back to the 1970s in Scandinavia. That's where it originated, and then it spread to other parts of the world. But Helen says it's currently undergoing something of a renaissance.
I do think something new is happening today. It's a turn against consumer lifestyles, wastefulness. There's a shift from the sort of slightly more social aspect from the 1970s, which was quite countercultural, to a much stronger imperative around ecological emergency, climate emergency. So we've got a kind of younger activist demographic coming in. But you can also see that in the very recent time, the pandemic has really shone a light on loneliness, people living alone, isolation, social isolation. An aging population is a big motivator for looking again at co-housing. Here in the UK, we have an aging population, and the housing options for living independently are incredibly limited. And often there's a sense of you either cling on to your independence in a home that might be too big for your needs and difficult to maintain and lonely and isolated, or you get shoved into some sort of care home where you only get a bedroom, and then you're at the mercy of a nursing system. So it's not only that co-housing has maybe seen a resurgence, and it has, there are many more inquiries about this housing form. I think more importantly, it's invited a conversation around alternative ways of living. There must be a better way. We shouldn't all be living in single family dwellings where inevitably 1 in 4 of us are going to be in a family dwelling of just one person living alone for many, many decades.
The cultural dimension to this, Helen, because your research, it's in different countries, right? Could you perhaps explain a bit what kind of differences you've observed in these projects, in Australia, US, Scandinavia, etc.?
Yeah, there are similarities and differences. The main difference would be, I think, the sort of barriers to development, and the barriers are generally land and money. but they're also cultural in as much as levels of trust and the extent to which people find it natural to gather together in groups. It wouldn't surprise you to say that the Scandinavian countries have very high levels of trust generally in their political leaders and their local authorities and in government, but also high levels of trust among neighbours. There's a sort of a cultural pattern of behaviour around, neighbourhood mutual aid. Australia and the US and the UK culturally are a little bit more similar in terms of the emphasis, both from governments but also in terms of society, on individual private ownership, and that's really been quite hard to reverse or to shift.
Helen is absolutely clear. She thinks sharing will play a bigger role in how we'll live in the future, even sharing our homes. But I have to admit, I am really rather sceptical just how many people would be willing to share their living space with strangers, even if they could end up becoming friends over time. So let's just go back to environmental psychologist Sally Augustin. Just how easy is it for us to share?
It's hard for us to share often because we have conflicting goals for a space in terms of, what sort of things will happen there. A space where I might want to relax and take a nap might be right next to the place where you want to play your tuba and practice for hours and hours and hours, for example. So you can have conflicting objectives. Perhaps there might be conflicts between what one person wants to say about what's important to them and what another person wants to say is significant about how they live their life. For example, extroverts prefer more open environments, say you might think of that as with fewer walls between one sort of area and another area, while introverts prefer that a space be more segmented. So you can have differences in objectives, ways of processing information, etc., that can lead to issues with sharing a space.
Okay, it's time now to find out how living with strangers works in practice.
My name is Siv Helene Stangeland. I'm a partner and founder in Helen Hard architect firm, but I'm also part of a company that has developed a co-housing concept we call Gaining by Sharing.
Siv's architecture firm started working on a co-housing project in the city of Stavanger in southwestern Norway in 2011. And their plan was basically to build sustainable living spaces that reduce the carbon footprint and create a sense of community. The project is called Vindmøllebakken, and it's built from wood, so no concrete at all. There are 40 units there, and Siv and her partner actually live in one of them themselves.
I think it's important also to be clear, a co-housing can be very, very different depending on the model, because you have today all types flourishing. The rental model where you have only young people and the main intention is maybe to provide a very cheap unit in a big city. You have these collective hubs in London, for example. And then you have the kind of service-based communities for elder people, which is something very different again. And what we try to provide in our model is community-driven. It's all based on people being active themselves. So
and the people in your group, they all own their units.
Yeah. And then that's also then the difference. This is or what we call self-ownership model, which is the dominating kind of model in Norway and also in the other Scandinavian countries. There are not so much rental housing. So it's based on kind of a model that we know in that case, but it also provides a better kind of ground for user participation, because if you're going to own your unit and the common space together, you will engage, of course, to make that work for you. The range of spaces, private unit spaces between 25 square meters, that's nearly just like a small studio, and up to 85, I think, is the biggest one. We owe together 500 square meters. So it's like each flat then buy 12 square meter of the shared common space in addition to their private units. And that means that, yes, we move into a smaller space, but we have 500 square meter with shared space, which is a lot. And in this shared space, there is all kind of different rooms, big kitchen, community space, library, party space, co-working space, space for people with children to play.
Right.
There is a place to grow on the roof. There is a glass house to meet up on the roof. And the garden outside.
I saw some pictures from the pilot project, and it looked stunning. These huge rooms, all wood and wonderful architecture. It looked really inviting, very, very nice. But let's just say, I mean, for instance, now I built a house 6 years ago, a huge environmental sin, mainly concrete. Sorry, I wouldn't do it again, but but I did do it back then. I've got 3 kids. Let's say, I wanted to move into your project, if it were possible. I mean, what would the process have been for me if I'd sort of, said, okay, Siv, I'm really interested. What happens next?
Then you would be invited into a course, we call it, a kind of dwelling course over 3 weeks, where you are together with a group of people that are interested, attending 2 to 3 hours a week, where we go through all the different issues and topics.
Okay.
Which is a lot. And you also get to kind of pronounce your own needs, because in that period, the things are not set. So if you need your 3 sleeping rooms for your 3 kids, you can say that, and we as architects will try then to adjust the project so that you get what you need in your unit. What is important for you and your family in the shared areas?
What I'm sort of wondering, with people, I would imagine they're on their best behavior, right? If they want to get into this project. And I'm sort of wondering just myself now, if I were sitting there and more or less, looking at this, being interviewed perhaps to a certain degree, is it something where people feel compelled to say, yeah, I'm happy to share everything, but then when it comes to real life, it's like, actually, I'd rather eat on my own today, or I'd rather do this on my own today? I mean, is that a problem?
Yeah, no, because that's the next part of it, which is maybe more important, is to talk through what are the intentions in this community, because the gaining by sharing model, as we call it, is only kind of saying that there is an overall intention of building a community here, but what this community is going to do together, how it's going to be kind of run in the everyday life situations, is up to the community. So the only thing we say is that you should have a house meeting every month, because that's somehow the minimum for running it. You get also to know what the consensus process is and how to do it in a good way, efficient way. So we give advice, and we also have some kind of guidelines on that. But then when it comes to how much this community is going to do together, that's up to the community. Every private unit is fully equipped. You have your own kitchen, you have your own of everything. It's smaller. That means you are not obliged to use the common areas or the common kitchen. In this respect, there is a lot of freedom into how much you want to engage, and we have found out that people today need that freedom. So that's one thing. The other is that we really try to share as much as possible, so we don't need to have things 40 times in our own apartments. But then the thing that more and more, people kind of pull out and they talk about why they live there is the social part, because that's what you experience each day, is this great, rich life and secure and joyful thing to be part of a thriving community.
These 40 units, there must be points of friction. It's like in any other house, right? So people living together, there are good days, there are bad days. What would you say are the main points of friction, and how do you resolve those problems?
Yeah, that's very interesting. And of course, you're right. We have our frictions, our frustrations, and there will always be people that have different opinions and ideas and expectations about the use and how to furnish things or how proper it should be when you leave it. I mean, it's all these things, where to smoke and not to smoke. What we have learned is that we need to put all the small frictions on the table as soon as possible, because if they are there and people start to build kind of groups that are for and kind of lobbying to get your point of view through, that's not a healthy way. The best way is to use these monthly meetings, put it on the table, and have a kind of consensus process. And this thing with consensus processes is something to learn, because it seems in the beginning very heavy and difficult, but we have experienced again and again that when we listen to all of our different views and opinions, we start to see a bigger picture of something.
On a practical level, I'm just trying to sort of, picture this. Is this really possible to do without leadership? Or do you have any form of hierarchy or a rotational system where somebody, sort of takes the lead? Or does this all just happen miraculously when you come together as a group?
No, there is of course there is a hierarchy, but it only kind of steps in when we cannot find a way to self-organize. So there is a board, but I think the clever thing we've found out is that we have groups that also take care of good processes. So if there is an issue, there is also a group that kind of love to find out how can we make a good process around this issue. And then there are skilled people in leading the house meetings. They know how to kind of make an efficient meeting work. So there are some skills I think we learn, and we could also learn earlier. That's something that we take into the gaining by sharing model, that how to run a co-housing project is something you can maybe be helped to do in the very beginning in a more efficient way, because there is a lot of experience out there and we can learn from each other.
I mean, this is obviously a sickness of journalism, but I have to look at the worst case scenario potentially. I mean, given that, all these people, they own these units. I mean, what happens if something really goes wrong and you've got somebody in a unit who just really is disrupting the whole group? Have you got, a backup plan for buying that person out? And what do you do if that person doesn't want to be bought out? Or, how do you resolve those sort of things?
Yeah, the easy way is we have some house rules. And we also have a rule saying that if these house rules are not kind of respected again and again, the board can make a first step contacting this person or unit and kind of say, if you don't change now, we will have to go to a next step. And so there is a kind of formal way to provoke a kind of separation if it doesn't work. But of course, we try everything to avoid that. But I think it's important to have some house rules that everyone has agreed upon, so that you can say, okay, but this is not according to what we have agreed upon. One rule is, if you're insecure about something, ask your neighbor. So we use these rules to keep in contact with each other, and thereby I think it's a way to avoid conflict.
Siv, you started this in 2011. With hindsight now, how has this changed you, or has it changed you, this experience?
Oh, I learned a lot, I think, about how different we are. It's nearly difficult to now think about living alone, because I would never move back again into an own flat. I think my life has become so much more rich and healthy in that respect, because I meet people that are so different from me every day. And to have this feeling of being part of a community, that it's difficult to put the words on it, but it's this feeling of being safe, to meet people that greet you in a warm way and ask, how are you? And maybe a little bit more than that, because you always talk a little bit with people, which is very different when you live in a housing block. People don't say high even. So I I appreciate these meetings every day where I feel that people care. I'm luckier as a person in general. Yeah.
Did you also make this experience maybe, or do people make this experience that it fills a void? That it's something, they've been looking for and they didn't know they were looking for this all along?
Yeah. Some people are really kind of surprised by the impact it has. So it's something that we discover kind of when we live there again and again, what it makes with us and the difference it is. We talk about that a lot, that it's difficult to explain. It's something you have to experience.
So I'm kind of wondering, I'm sort of a bit torn. On the one hand, I'm wondering, if this is so great, why aren't more people doing this? Why doesn't this become the new normal?
Yeah.
So, I mean, have you got any ideas on that? Is it a structural problem why this is not happening more? Or is it because we as humans aren't ready for this yet? We're not wired like this yet? Or have we forgotten how to live together?
Oh, I think there are a lot of very interesting issues there. I think culturally we are also different. I know that's proven by research that, for example, Norwegians has a very high degree of social trust. But then I think there are other cultures that are more wired to it. I had a seminar in Italy during the Biennale where we also exposed the co-housing project. And of course, Italians are very much kind of socially engaged. It's like they do this in the streets or in their plazas. So they have a social life culturally embedded. And still they want to provide for co-housing because they have new family patterns, changing how they arrange themselves in their neighborhoods. Their lack is more architecturally to provide for this. Whereas in Norway, I would say we need to move closer to have that kind of social life. So the architecture has to help people to contact each other. We are not socially glued. We have a social trust, but we don't have a social glue necessary. We are used to live quite far from each other. And we are not so many people. We have to provide for people meeting each other. If not, we don't meet. I think every one of us feels that we need maybe to do something about the global issues we have, and we can do that through how we choose to live, and that's why I think it is maybe another intention now and another possibility now for organizing us in a new way.
Siv, thank you very much for your time and talking to us here at On the Green Fence. We do appreciate it.
Thank you so much as well.
Okay, so normally this is the time for my main takeaways, but seeing that this is also the final episode of our housing series, I thought I'd try something a bit different and broaden the perspective this time round for the final wrap. Siv just mentioned the cultural differences between Norwegians and Italians, for instance, but I was wondering, how co-housing is viewed outside the Northern Hemisphere and also in one of the world's most populous countries, namely India. And so I'm really glad that my Indian colleague, Ashutosh Pandey from DW's business desk, made some time for me today. Welcome, Ashutosh.
Thanks a lot, Neil, for having me. It's always a pleasure.
Ashutosh, you just heard Siv describing her co-housing project. What's your verdict? Which points stuck with you there?
Quite a few. Firstly, the emphasis on sustainable living and the emphasis on meaningful collaboration with people. But what stuck with me is this yearning to live in a community, to that yearning to be part of a community. That is something that stuck with me. And I don't see this very different from what it is in India so far. In the smaller towns, we've lived in colonies or societies where you would have children play in different homes every day. It would be a different parent taking care of these kids. We would celebrate festivals together. We would always go and greet each other every morning. So this is something that I don't really miss when I go to the smaller towns. It's becoming a rare thing in the bigger towns where people have moved into these high rises, and that's the thing. Even she mentioned here that we don't even get time, or we don't even say hello to. We don't even acknowledge somebody around us. That is something that's creeping in as far as the dwellers in the bigger cities are concerned. But the community life is, I think it's everywhere in India. So much so that sometimes it becomes a pain, like, because your neighbors are so much involved in your lives.
You can't get them out of the house.
You can't even get them out of your house. So, or sometimes they will just leave the noisy kids with you, and you got to bear with them throughout the day. If you are a homemaker and the others are going out to work, then you become basically the person looking after the kids of the entire lane. So you basically don't get an opportunity to rest if you're a homemaker in India, in a society like that. But yes, things are changing fast in the bigger towns. Interestingly, there is now emphasis on co-living among the millennials. I mean, the co-living is not in the purest sense co-housing, where you're not owning a property. Basically, you're sharing a space with other people. So you are in a city and you move to a different city to work. And that's where you realize that you're totally new or stranger in that city. That's where you connect with other strangers. So why not share the space? And I feel that's a positive move in a way. And it also is not only from, if you talk about the thriving community bit, but it also helps in promoting sustainable living, because then it's these individuals who are mostly gone to work in these bigger cities. They could have ended up buying their own refrigerators, their own television sets, their own ovens, microwaves, and now here they are in a house where they're sharing all these appliances. So that's a positive.
Right. But if we look at the co-housing aspect, just coming back to Siv, I mean, you're a father, right?
Yeah.
Young kid?
Yeah.
Wife?
Yeah.
How are you living right now? Rent or ownership?
On rent.
On rent. So, I mean, this concept that Siv described, is that something that would appeal to you? Would you like to get your family into such a unit, or would you have reservations?
It's interesting. I would love that my kid is brought up by 40 other families, gets to know different points of views, exposed to diversity at a very young age. These are the positives. But I do feel that it is easier said than done. There would be some, I mean, when you're back from work where you're already interacting with so many people, when you're home, I feel that that's a point where you would like to go back to yourself, reflect about on the day that you've just had, and also unwind a little. And here, maybe it would be too much of engagement with other people. And that's where maybe somebody could be nosy. It's difficult to say how it's going to turn out, the experience. If you are an introvert, it becomes a pain altogether, a bigger trouble for you that you've got to now face another 40 set of people every day when you're back from work. So, yeah, in my case, I think it would be a good experiment to try, but not in the purest form, this co-housing. I would love that there is a community, there is meaningful collaboration. Maybe we pool our cars, we occasionally borrow stuff like appliances that somebody, like a drilling machine or things like that, and all that is happening on a regular basis. But I think that is enough. It wouldn't be more than that.
But how is it for you, if we're contrasting now Germany and India? Because I find, where I live, for instance, there are a lot of detached houses. It's all about ownership, really. A lot of fences, a lot of plots, but it's all separate. And there isn't really, I don't know. I mean, you have now and again, like at Christmas, you have a Christmas market or these sort of things. There are events where the town comes together, but it's all rather anonymous. It's not like a community spirit in that sense, or at least I don't feel that way when I go there. Is that something that struck you when you came to Germany, that the Germans sort of live together but apart?
The thing that struck me the most was the fact that there was very few conversations that were happening between neighbors. They seem to lead a very independent life, irrespective of who the next door person is or things like that. That wasn't the case when I was growing up in India or in my small town.
If we look at, the ownership aspect, how important is it to actually own your own property in India? Is this something also that is maybe changing, with the rising population and affordability issues?
It's very important to own your own place. It's largely seen as aspirational or social status. But there is also this thing about social security, right? India does not really have a very strong social security net as of now, as you find in the West, where the state would take care of you once you retire.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned a lot of aspects there, a lot of it, social security status, also like a long-term investment, securing the family in the long run, etc. How important are environmental issues when it comes to, housing? Is that something that is starting to play a role, or is it more important?
I really don't think so. So far, it's a major conversation among people in India. I don't really think so. Maybe the younger lot.
I mean, housing, it's clear, it needs to become greener, it needs to become more resilient with climate change. Some of the potential solutions we looked at in this series, they ranged from using sustainable building materials, reducing our energy levels with passive housing, for instance, reducing our living space with tiny houses was one example, and now in this episode, the aspect of sharing with co-housing. Ashutosh, now, speaking as a senior business editor, I mean, where would you invest your money here? What's the future? What's the future trend, and what's a dead end?
You should be diversified in investing. That's a golden rule. You don't have to put all your eggs in one basket.
All right. Well, I think that just about wraps up this episode on co-housing. Ashutosh Pandey from DW's Business Desk, thank you very much for joining us here with On the Green Fence.
My pleasure, Neil. Thanks.
And thank you very much to all our listeners for downloading and subscribing to On the Green Fence. If you really want to make our day, please post a short review on Apple Podcasts or hit that 5-star button. Many thanks to my colleague and producer Natalie Muller and my sound engineer Nicodemus Braun. And don't forget, if you want to get in touch with ideas or feedback, you can always send us an email to onthegreenfence@dw.com. My name is Neil King. Take it easy and take care. On the Green Fence.